Hey everyone, welcome to this week's reading, Shard of the Sun. We're picking up where we left off with chapter 13. Roderick had spent the last 2 days traveling from town to town, seeking information on the black-clothed man. Most everyone he talked to hadn't seen anyone that matched the description. Roderick was starting to wonder if he had gone the wrong direction when he reached a small village and received the same answers to his questions. An old man in one of the taverns, however, piqued his interest. He had a small gathering of people around him, and at first, Broderick thought the old man was telling a story. When he walked by, he heard some of what was being said. I was afraid for my life. He looked normal enough, but there was something about him that radiated evil. He wore all black, and his horse was black as well. I saw him do something odd with his hands, and there was a bright flash of light. He's a wizard, I've no doubt. Broderick waited until the crowd had dispersed, bored with the old man's story. Then he made his way over to the man's table and asked to join him. Eager for more attention, the old man obliged him. The story you just told everyone. Is it true? The old man scowled at him. You think I'm lying, don't you? He puffed his chest out indignantly. Broderick had stifled his laughter at the man's attempt at bravado. He couldn't be younger than 70 years, Broderick had mused. No, I don't think you were lying. What I meant was, are all the details true? You didn't exaggerate any of them? The old man took a sip from his brass tankard and shook his head. I'm too old to be telling fanciful tales, my boy. What would be the point? Besides, I've seen much more interesting things than that in my long life. I was a child during the demon invasion, you know. Broderick doubted that, but he humored the man to get some answers. This man that you saw, he wore all black, you said. The man nodded and took another drink of his brew. That he was. Could have been leather, but from the way it swayed in the wind, I would say it was most likely made of cloth. He had a hood, too, but it fell off his head, and that's how I saw he was an ordinary man. Except for the magic, of course. Of course, Roderick absently agreed. Which way was he traveling? The old man scratched the side of his head and squinted his eyes. North, he finally answered. He had attempted to explain how he knew it was north, where he was standing as he watched the man ride away, and other trivial details. Roger thanked the man and went on his way. Now he stood at the edge of town and stared at the road that forked, one way to the east and the other to the north. What if the old man was wrong? What if the black-clothed rider went east instead of north? He sighed. If he found nothing to the north, then he would come back and go east. He had bought a horse 2 towns back, and that had sped up his search tremendously. His feet had gotten blistered from walking such long distances. He mounted his horse and headed north. The hours burned away as he rode on. The road was well worn, but he didn't see any more towns. Eventually, he stopped next to a small stream to water his horse and rest. It was mid-afternoon, and he was beginning to wonder if he would find a comfortable place to sleep. After his mount had drunk its fill, he continued his trek. Several hours later, he still hadn't found another town. The air had cooled tremendously. Broderick thought he could see snow in the distance. He found a spot beneath a small copse of trees that seemed the best place to rest. After tethering his horse to one of the branches, he laid out his blanket and stared up into the sky. It was quiet and peaceful. It reminded him of his home on the lake. He got homesick and tried to turn his thoughts to other things. He wondered how Derek was doing without his wife. Probably not very well, he thought. The sound of twigs breaking caused him to sit up. The horse snickered softly, but he didn't seem alarmed. Roger got up and unsheathed his sword. There was no telling what sort of animals roamed the wilds here. He moved cautiously in the direction he had heard the sound. There were few clouds in the sky, and the moon was bright, giving him plenty of light to see by. 100 feet or so away, he spotted a deer. It was brown and speckled with white splotches. It raised its ears in alarm as it sniffed the air, then turned and darted away into the trees. Just a deer, Roderick said to himself, thankful it wasn't something aggressive. A splitting pain erupted in the back of his head, and he crumpled to the ground in a heap. His vision blurred, and it was starting to go dark. He heard voices, but he couldn't make out what they were saying. Before blackness took him, he felt as though he were flying. Broderick awoke to find his wrists chained to a wall above his head. He groaned loudly as he felt his head pounding. Where am I? His grogginess slowly faded, and he began to study his surroundings. He was in a small cell. The chains that manacled his wrist were attached to iron rings that had been drilled into the stone wall behind him. He was freezing, and his throat was parched. He attempted to stand and found it difficult to do so. Using the chains as leverage, he managed to get to his feet. The chains were shorter than he would have liked, and he couldn't reach the gate of his cell. Probably wouldn't have done any good anyway, as he assumed it was locked. "Hey!" he called out. "Let me out of here!" His words echoed off the stone walls around him and seemed not to reach anyone. Rats scurried about on the floor. He didn't know where he was or what had happened. Apparently, from the way his head was pounding, he'd taken a pretty strong blow. He had no way of knowing how much time had passed, and slumped back down the wall. He was starting to doze off when the sound of boots thumping down the hall in front of his cell reached his ears. There was hardly any light, but he could see the outline of the black-clothed man he had been trying to trail. "Who are you?" he demanded. There was no answer. Roderick heard the jingling of keys as the man unlocked the gate and stepped inside. It was too dark to make out any of the figure's details. The man grabbed Broderick's wrists and unlocked the manacles. Then he roughly lifted him up and pushed him out of the cell. All of his questions and demands were met with silence. The man guided him through the dim corridors into a chamber that reminded Broderick of a tavern. Various multicolored tapestries hung from the walls, depicting an array of scenes. An enormous table rested in the center of the room, covered with a multitude of papers. The man pushed him into one of the chairs at the table and motioned for him to stay put, then disappeared through one of the doors. In the light, he realized this was not the same man he had been tracking. Roderick curiously looked over the papers on the table. The writing was nothing he had ever seen before. Runes and symbols were drawn all over them. There was one word that he could make out, the same word that was etched into the blade his cousin had given him. Sorandra. He considered the coincidence for a moment before he heard the door swing open. He was greeted by an old man, much older than the one he met at the village. His head was devoid of any hair at all, and his face was creased with many wrinkles. He shuffled slowly over to the table, resting his weight on a staff. The man was dressed similarly to the mute man, though this man's clothes were of much better quality. They were flowing black robes trimmed in silver. The old man sat down and studied Broderick for long moments. He made a motion with his hand, and the other man brought a sword to him. The old man unsheathed it and laid it across the table. Broderick saw it was his own sword. "Do you know the history of this blade?" the old man asked. His voice was low and cracked with age. Broderick didn't answer. "Why should I? They've imprisoned me." Under the old man's harsh gaze, however, Broderick resolved melted. "No. It was a gift from my cousin. Who are you, and why am I here?" In the silence, Broderick could hear the old man wheezing. He ran his fingers along the blade of the sword, feeling every rune etched on its surface. "My name is Farron, and you are here because you have something I want. We will have time for your questions later. This sword," Farron nodded at it, "is a powerful relic from an ancient time. This blade was crafted in the Starforge Mountains by a warrior mage of great renown. It was to serve a single purpose, to destroy evil. The enchantments on it protect the wielder from many things. How did your cousin come across it, I wonder?" Roderick decided that stubbornness would likely get him nowhere. "I don't know. He only said it was in the family for a long time." Farron stared at him intently. "It may be true," he said, more to himself than to Broderick. The silence resumed, but Broderick grew frustrated. "What is it that I have that would make you attack me so violently?" he asked angrily. "There was no need to get upset," Farron said. "Just ask my apprentice there." He pointed toward the other man. Broderick looked at him, and Lion pulled the collar of his robe down to reveal a large scar across his throat. Broderick shuddered at the sight and looked back at the old man. "Bad things happen when people get upset." Farron smiled maliciously. "There is something you found, something small that fell from the sky. I want it." Farron leaned forward and stretched out his hand. Broderick eyed Farron's hand distrustfully. "Why would I give it to you?" he questioned. "To keep from dying," Farron answered curtly. "I could boil the flesh off your body with a single word if I so desired. I can torment you in ways that will leave you wishing for death. Yet it will not come." Broderick had no doubts that Farron could, and would, commit such atrocities against him. "Why didn't you just take it from me while I was unconscious? Wouldn't that have saved you the headache of waiting for me to wake up? And then you could have killed me or dumped me somewhere. Why all this? Broderick motioned his hand to encompass the room. That wouldn't be any fun, Farron replied. I want to see how the shard works, he added. He rose from his chair and ordered his apprentice to come near. Liam knelt down before Farron. The old man placed his hand on the apprentice's head and began to whisper words that gave Broderick chills. The mute man opened his eyes in a silent cry of pain and fell to the floor. He squirmed on the ground, blood spilling out of his eyes. Broderick stared, horrified. What are you doing to him? He cried. Farron watched it all with an emotionless detachment that bewildered Broderick. After some more thrashing about, the man lay still in his own blood. Farron turned his fiery gaze on Broderick. Touch him, he commanded. Broderick's mind screamed at him to stay put. But the mute man was better off dead than serving this vile creature of a man. Yet his body betrayed him, and he watched his own hand reach out and touch the dead man. As with the others, a few moments passed, and then the man opened his eyes. He had the same look like all the others. The man coughed a few times, and a look of confusion crossed his face. He got to his feet and looked at Farron. I was dead. The words came out hesitantly, as though he didn't know how to speak. Farron was impressed. Not only had the shard brought his apprentice back to life, it had also healed the damage to his vocal cords. That was powerful magic indeed. Give me the shard, he said, excitement tingling throughout his old bones. Broderick took a step back, away from him. Farron scowled at him and shuffled forward. Suddenly the room shook violently. Trails of dust fell from between the stones in the ceiling. All three of them looked about, trying to figure out what had just happened. And then the room shook again, stronger this time. Farron got a wild look in his eyes and fled the room as quickly as his legs would allow him. The man, who had been mute, looked at Broderick, then followed his master. Broderick got up and grabbed his sword off the table. He didn't know what was going on, but it was the perfect distraction to stage an escape. He left the chamber through the same door as Farron. A long corridor ended at two wooden doors. He ran to the doors and pressed his ear to the wood to see what he could hear. There was no sounds. He pulled on the door, but it didn't budge. How did the old man open it? He wondered. He sheathed the sword and tied it to his belt, wrapping both hands around the handle. He heaved with all his might. The door grudgingly creaked open slowly. It was thick and heavy, and Broderick's muscles bulged under the strain. He finally got it open enough to slide through the breach. A large open courtyard spread out before him. He had never seen anything so massive. He saw Farron and two other men standing on the battlements. Now was his chance. There was a door on the right side, and he ran for it. Out of the shadows, a third man stepped out to meet him. Broderick halted and drew his sword. Move out of my way, and I won't cut you down, he threatened. The man didn't seem impressed. He was wearing the same clothes as the others. Bias wasn't going to let the man escape with the shard. He blocked the way with his body, prepared to stop him. He lifted his hand and unleashed a blast of flames from his hand. The heat drove Broderick back a few steps, but the flames died as they neared him. The wizard looked perplexed at this and cast the fire forth again. Twice the flames died as they reached him. Bias snarled and stalked toward him. Broderick raised the sword menacingly, and Bias grabbed the blade in his hand and yanked it from Broderick's grasp. The metal bit into his flesh, but he ignored the pain and flung the blade across the courtyard. Bias slugged Broderick in the jaw, knocking him down. Blood dripped from Bias's palm. Broderick was dazed and didn't fight when Bias jerked him up and dragged him to the stairs that led to the battlements where Farron stood. Broderick reluctantly climbed the stairs and looked out over the wall. A sizable army greeted him, and in the front was the unmistakable form of his cousin, and next to him was Kira. Release my cousin, Derek demanded loudly. Farron laughed. Do you honestly think your pathetic weapons serve you here? Derek and Kira parted to reveal an older woman, wearing robes of a similar style as those Farron wore. Nidria, Farron spat. You would betray me? He asked the sorceress. Pays well, she replied with a shrug. Now release him, or I will tear apart your castle stone by stone. I'll let you choose, Farron called back. You can have this one, or the woman. Derek looked to Nidria, then back to Farron. What woman? Your wife, Farron replied. All right, that's it for this week. Hope you guys are still enjoying where the story is going, and we'll be back next week. See you guys.